Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Absolutely.
So I want you to imagine, just for a second, being handed this manual, an instruction manual on how to peacefully coexist with the exact same people who possess the power and the inclination to execute you.
Yeah, quite the scenario.
Right. That is exactly what we are opening up today. It's essentially a survival guide written for this deeply fractured, really volatile startup community.
And they're living squarely in the crosshairs of the most tyrannical empire on Earth at the time.
Exactly.
I mean, it sounds like the premise of a dystopian thriller, you know?
Yeah.
But it is historical reality. We are looking at a highly concentrated, incredibly potent section of an ancient document.
Which is chapters 12 through 16 of the biblical book of Romans.
That's the one. The author is the Apostle Paul, and he's writing to this group of early Christians who are living in the absolute epicenter of the known world.
And our mission today is to guide you, the listener, through this specific block of text. We really want to extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and, the actual life application.
Because we are moving way beyond abstract theological theory here.
Way beyond it. Like the first 11 chapters of this letter are notoriously dense theology, but then chapter 12 hits and it shifts gears completely.
Oh, cool.
We are getting into the gritty, boots on the ground how-to of daily living. But before we look at the how, I feel like we desperately need to understand the where and the who.
Yeah, the context is everything.
Right. So set the scene for us. What was actually happening in Rome when this letter arrived?
Well, Rome wasn't just a big city. It was the psychological, economic, and political center of gravity for millions of people.
The hub of the world.
Exactly. Think of the wealth of Wall Street, the political machinery of Washington, D.C., and the cultural dominance of Hollywood.
It's all mashed into one.
All mashed into one overcrowded, incredibly tense, ancient metropolis. And the audience receiving this letter, well, they are a mess.
A total mess.
It is a diverse, highly suspicious mix of Jewish and Gentile believers who are desperately trying to figure out how to be a community.
It makes me think of a modern startup that was just born out of a chaotic, forced merger of two totally different company cultures.
That is a brilliant analogy.
Yeah, on one side, you have the Jewish believers. They are deeply rooted in centuries of tradition, dietary laws, and a very strict moral code.
Right. Very structured.
And then on the other side, you have the Gentile believers coming out of a completely different Greco-Roman worldview. They're bringing totally different habits and assumptions to the table.
And you drop this newly merged, highly unstable community right into the middle of a hyper-regulated, hostile city.
And hostile is probably putting it mildly, right?
Oh, very mildly.
Yeah.
We are talking about an empire ruled by deeply flawed, paranoid, and often completely tyrannical emperors.
Like who?
Well, Claudius, for example, had actually expelled the Jews from Rome just a few years prior to this letter because of riots.
Oh, wow. So they are just now filtering back in.
Exactly. They're coming back. Tensions are high. And then you have Nero looming on the horizon.
The Nero.
The guy who would later use Christians as human torches to light his gardens.
That is horrifying.
It's terrifying. The state wields absolute power. So you have to understand, these people aren't reading this letter in some serene, quiet monastery.
No, they're in the thick of it.
They're reading it in the shadows of the Palatine Hill. They're surrounded by pagan temples, gladiatorial games, and a culture that views them as this obscure, subversive, and potentially dangerous cult.
Which is exactly why they needed an operational manual. How do they survive without tearing each other apart inside the church and without getting themselves wiped out by the empire on the outside?
But that is what Paul provides. But the fascinating thing is, he doesn't start with civic duties. He doesn't start with church administration.
Right, he goes internal first.
He starts with a radical rewiring of the individual. Chapter 12 opens with this incredibly vivid, jarring command. He urges the readers to present their bodies as a living sacrifice.
A living sacrifice. I mean, we use the word sacrifice so casually today. I sacrifice my weekend to help you move. But in a first century context, that phrase had to sound like a complete oxymoron.
It was a deliberate, shocking paradox. I mean, to understand this, you really have to, smell the ancient world.
Okay, paint that picture.
Whether you were Jewish, walking into the temple in Jerusalem, or a pagan Roman walking past the Pantheon, a sacrifice meant one thing.
Death.
It was an animal slain on an altar, blood was spilled. It was a transaction of life for favor.
Right.
And the defining characteristic of a sacrifice was that it was dead. The original audience would have instantly visualized a carcass.
So Paul takes this deeply ingrained, just visceral cultural concept and flips it entirely on its head.
Completely. The biblical commentaries we are drawing heavily from today, specifically the works of the 19th century theologian Albert Barnes and the 18th century scholar Matthew Henry, they provide some brilliant insight into this pivot.
What do they say?
Well, Barnes notes that the ancient Jewish worshiper offered his victim, slew it, and presented it dead. It was finite. It could never be presented again.
Because it's gone.
Right. But this new path demands vigorous, active, ongoing powers. God doesn't want dead, rigid rituals. He wants your living, breathing, vital energies.
It's an active surrender. And the text calls this presentation of the body our reasonable service. That word reasonable really catches my eye. It implies logic.
You've hit on a crucial detail there. The original Greek term there is logikos, which is exactly where we get the English word logic.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Matthew Henry points out that it's the soul that presents the body. It is an act of deep reason. God deals with us as rational creatures.
So it's not just blind emotion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This isn't blind, emotional, mindless devotion where you just, check your brain at the door. It is a highly thoughtful, calculated dedication of your entire being to a higher purpose.
Based entirely on the mercies you have already received, as the text says.
Yes.
So that's the internal baseline. You dedicate your vital energies. But immediately, the manual pivots to how this new dedication interfaces with the external world.
Right.
The very next sentence says, "And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind."
And translating this into 21st century realities is where it gets incredibly challenging for us today.
What so?
Well, the Greek word for conformed literally means to put on the external fashion, the shape or the appearance of another.
Like putting on a costume.
Exactly. It's adopting the schema of the age. In Paul's day, that meant not letting the violent, pleasure-seeking, status-obsessed Roman culture dictate your values.
I look at our world today, and the pressure to conform is arguably more pervasive now because it's digital.
Oh, it's everywhere.
It's in our pockets. Conforming to the world today means letting the cultural algorithms, the 24-hour outrage cycles, the fleeting digital fashions dictate your shape.
And the relentless, exhausting push for wealth and status. We are constantly being pressed into a mold.
Constantly.
And human nature almost always prefers the path of least resistance. We conform because it's easier. It reduces social friction.
Yeah, standing out is hard.
But Barnes emphasizes a really profound point here. He says, all external behavioral changes are completely useless. Or worse, they're just theater on hypocrisy, if the mind itself isn't fundamentally changed.
Think about conforming to the world like buying a new phone case. You're just changing the external shell to match whatever color is trending this month.
That's a great way to look at it.
It's superficial, it's easy, and you can just change it again next week when the trend dies, but renewing your mind, as the text demands.
That's a whole different ballgame.
That is like completely rewriting the entire operating system of the phone from the ground up. You're changing how the device processes data, how it uses its battery, what programs it can even run.
Yeah, the text actually uses the word from which we get the English word metamorphosis, a total, irreversible internal transformation.
That analogy perfectly captures the depth of what Paul is demanding. But it also highlights the primary obstacle to growth for modern readers, I think.
What the?
Well, we naturally resist this concept of being a living sacrifice with a rewritten operating system because it requires the death of our autonomy.
Yeah.
This text fundamentally assaults the modern Western obsession with self-sovereignty. The idea that I belong to me, I speak my truth, and I exist to serve my own desires. We all want to be the CEO of our own lives.
Precisely. And this manual says, no, you are willingly presenting yourself to a higher authority. You are relinquishing the absolute claim to yourself.
Which sounds terrifying to modern ears.
It does. But the beautiful paradox is that this surrender is what actually brings clarity. The text says that by renewing your mind, you are finally able to prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God.
You can't see reality clearly while you are wearing the culture's glasses.
Exactly.
So let's nail down a practical takeaway for the listener right now. How do we apply this? Instead of a generic calendar audit, I want you to think about where you are currently sacrificing your autonomy to a modern empire.
That's a powerful question.
Where are you letting the algorithm, the corporate ladder, or the expectations of your peer group press you into a mold? And how can you actively rebel against that today by reclaiming your operating system?
It starts by acknowledging that you are serving a master.
Yeah.
You just have to choose which one.
Right.
And that internal revolution is the prerequisite. Because if you have completely rewritten your internal operating system, it is going to radically alter how you interface with other people. You cannot have this kind of metamorphosis without it bleeding into your community. Paul knows this, which is why he immediately transitions from the individual mind to the collective body.
This brings us to verses 3 through 13 of chapter 12. The core wisdom here is that true community requires functioning as interdependent parts of a single organism.
Yes.
And it requires utilizing our diverse gifts with a profound sense of humility.
Paul introduces the metaphor of a human body, which is a brilliant rhetorical device because it is universally understood.
Right. Everybody has a body.
Whether you are a Roman patrician or a Jewish tent maker, you get it. Barnes points out that the foundation of this community is an honest self-assessment.
Okay.
The text warns us not to think of ourselves more highly than we ought to think, but to judge ourselves soberly.
Which is incredibly hard to do. I mean, we usually oscillate between massive ego and crippling imposter syndrome. There's rarely an in-between.
Yes, and the body metaphor cures both. Think about the physical body. You have hands, feet, eyes, ears, internal organs. They do not all have the same office or function.
Obviously not.
Matthew Henry provides a striking image in his commentary. He says, imagine if the little finger were to demand and receive as much nourishment and blood flow as the entire leg.
That would be grotesque.
It would be grotesque, unseemly, and highly prejudicial to the health of the entire body. We are but parts. We are not the whole.
We can't all be the mouth.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And conversely, no one should despise another's role as insignificant. We can no more spare the foot than we can spare the eye.
Every part matters.
Every individual member is absolutely necessary for the proper symmetry and action of the whole.
The text actually lists out specific gifts to illustrate this, doesn't it?
It does.
It mentions prophecy, serving, teaching, exhorting, giving, leading, and showing mercy. What immediately stands out to me is the staggering variety and how horizontal it all is.
What do you mean by horizontal?
Well, you have high-profile, public-facing gifts like teaching and leading, positioned right alongside quiet, behind-the-scenes gifts like serving, giving, and showing mercy. Paul doesn't rank them.
This is a radical reframing, especially for a Roman culture that worshipped status, public speaking, and power.
It flips the hierarchy.
It really does. And it's equally challenging for our 21st century society. We live in a hyper-individualistic culture where everyone is pressured to be the founder, the visible influencer, the one holding the microphone.
Oh, definitely.
We lavish praise on the eye and the mouth, but we often completely ignore the supporting skeletal structure. This text challenges you to find profound, essential value in being a supporting player.
So what is the glue that holds these diverse, potentially jealous parts together? The text says, let love be without dissimulation. I had to look that word up.
It's an old one.
It basically means without hypocrisy. It has to be sincere. Looking at this word hypocrisy, it immediately makes me think of modern networking.
Oh, how so?
Well, you go to these corporate mixers, you hand out business cards, you ask people about their kids, and you fake this warm smile entirely because you want access to their capital or their network.
Right.
It's totally transactional.
And that transactional nature is exactly what Paul is targeting and condemning here. Transactional relationships are about extraction.
What can I get from you?
Right. I will simulate care for you so that you will propel me forward. But the love described in this text, the Greek word agai, implies a deep, benevolent, active goodwill that seeks the benefit of the other person. Full stop.
Not built on fake smiles.
Not at all. It's not built on forced sake smiles at a mixer.
It sounds gritty.
It is incredible gritty. The very next phrase says to abhor what is evil and cling to what is good. Barnes points out that this kind of community isn't just a polite social club. It is firmly, aggressively attached to goodness.
So love is an action, not a feeling.
Yes. Love here is not defined as a warm, fuzzy internal feeling. It is defined by external action. The text specifically commands distributing to the needs of the saints, practicing hospitality, and showing mercy.
And it says to show mercy with cheerfulness. That's a very specific instruction.
It is.
I think we've all been on the receiving end of someone doing us a favor, but doing it with a heavy sigh, checking their watch, making sure we know what a huge burden we are to them.
It ruins the gift, doesn't it?
It totally ruins it. You almost wish they hadn't helped at all.
Barnes has a wonderful psychological insight here. He notes that if moroseness, impatience, or fretfulness is discovered in us while we are helping someone who is sick or needy, It actually inflicts secondary pain on the person we are trying to benefit.
Oh, wow. Secondary pain.
The needies have enough to bear with their own poverty or illness without having to bear the harshness of professed friends. That is why the text demands a kind, benign, happy temper when showing mercy. The attitude matters just as much as the action.
So the practical reflection for the listener in this section is an ego check. Look at that list of gifts. Again, communicating truth, serving behind the scenes, teaching, encouraging, giving generously, organizing, or showing compassionate mercy.
Find where you fit.
Right. Identify your primary strength. Now, ask yourself the hard question. Are you using that strength to elevate yourself, build your own brand, and demand the nourishment of the leg for your little finger?
That's the danger.
Or are you offering it with sincere, non-transactional love to build up the people around you?
That kind of sincere love is the only thing that can insulate a community against the friction that inevitably arises.
What friction will arise?
Always. And that friction's where the manual goes next. How do you handle conflict when it boils over?
Let's get into it.
This brings us to verses 14 through 21 of chapter 12. And I will warn you, this is where the text goes from challenging to seemingly impossible.
The core wisdom here is breaking the cycle of retaliation by overcoming evil with good.
It is a profound, relentless escalation of demands. Listen to the sequence of commands Paul lays out. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse.
Okay.
Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Repay no one evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men.
It keeps building.
If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. And then the ultimate climax. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.
Bless those who persecute you. I just want to pause there because we read these ancient texts and they sound poetic, but we forget the reality.
We really do.
Paul is writing to people who will soon face actual physical persecution. Blessing the guy who cuts you off in traffic is hard enough.
Right.
Blessing the Roman magistrate who is confiscating your property or threatening your family, that is unnatural.
It is entirely countercultural, and it defies our biological programming.
But if we look at comparative human wisdom, we see echoes of this desire to transcend retaliation in other profound traditions.
Like what?
Well, Stoicism, which was highly popular in Rome at this time, focused heavily on controlling your inner response to external wrongs. The goal was not letting the abuser disturb your inner tranquility.
Right, maintaining your center. And in modern history, we see the philosophies of nonviolent resistance championed by leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi. The radical idea pulsing through this text is that the ultimate victory over an enemy isn't crushing them into the dirt.
What is it?
It is transforming them into a friend.
Okay, I track with the philosophy of nonviolence, but I have to push back on one specific phrase here that has always sounded deeply weird to me.
I think I know which one you mean.
Paul writes, therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head.
Yeah, the coals of fire.
Wait, is that just passive-aggressive revenge? Like, yeah. I know I can't punch you, so I'm going to be overwhelmingly, aggressively nice to you just to make you absolutely miserable and uncomfortable.
It's a fantastic question, and it is probably the most common misunderstanding of this entire chapter. Yeah. Let's look at what the source commentaries actually say, because Paul is quoting an older proverb here.
Okay, lay it on me.
Both Barnes and Henry clarify that the coals of fire absolutely do not represent divine vengeance or a secret, malicious desire to inflict psychological pain.
Then what do they mean?
To understand this, you have to think about ancient metallurgy.
Metallurgy? Like working with metal?
Yes. Think about the process of melting down hard, cold, unyielding metals, like gold or silver. You don't just put a fire underneath the crucible. You literally heap burning coals of fire on top of the metal to surround it with heat and melt it down.
Oh wow. So the goal isn't to burn the person. The goal is to melt the hostility.
Precisely. The pain described by the coals represents the burning pangs of conscience. It is the acute shame, the cognitive dissonance, and the remorse that a person feels when their unprovoked malice is suddenly met with unmerited, shocking kindness.
That makes so much more sense.
It is a sudden apprehension of their own wrongdoing that might actually lead to true repentance. The goal isn't to hurt them, it's to break their hardened posture so the relationship can be salvaged.
But man, is that an obstacle to growth. Listeners will naturally resist this because our biological instinct, our evolutionary hardwiring, is to strike back when we are struck.
It's the fight or flight response.
Exactly. If someone undermines you at work, your brain screams at you to sabotage them back. We want justice, and we want it delivered by our own hands immediately so we feel safe.
And that is exactly why this requires a renewed mind. Matthew Henry makes a profound theological point here. He says that to take revenge is to essentially step into the throne of God and take his work out of his hands.
You're playing God.
Right. When the text commands us to give place to wrath, it means to step aside, get out of the way.
Let the system handle it.
Let the moral arc of the universe, the system of justice, whether human magistrates or divine providence, handle the retribution. And in the meantime, the text concludes with this: do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.
Think about what that actually means. If someone does something evil to you, and your response is to become hateful, bitter, and vindictive,
then the evil has successfully infected you.
exactly. If you let someone else's malice turn you into a malicious person, you have been vanquished. You lost the fight. The evil one.
That is a mic drop moment. It changes the entire paradigm of winning and losing.
So let's make this actionable. Here is your how-to for this paradox. Think of someone who has recently wronged or slighted you.
We all have someone.
Right. It doesn't have to be a mortal enemy, maybe just a coworker who took credit for your idea, or a family member who made a passive-aggressive comment at dinner.
Sure.
This week, instead of venting about them to a friend and plotting your subtle revenge, find one specific, tangible way to do them a favor, or intentionally speak well of them behind their back.
Test the theory.
Test the coals of fire theory. See if unexpected kindness can melt their hostility.
It is a supremely difficult practice, but it is the only way to achieve interpersonal peace. But what happens when the conflict isn't just with a coworker, but with the state itself? Expanding this concept of conflict resolution brings us to chapter 13, verses 1 through 10. The core wisdom here is peaceful civic participation and viewing love as the ultimate fulfillment of all societal laws.
Now, before we dive into this, we need to pause and establish some guardrails.
Definitely.
We are about to talk about government, taxes, and submitting to authority. You and I must explicitly state to the listener that we are not taking any modern political sides here.
Zero sides.
We are not endorsing any specific political ideology, party, or modern movement. Our job is strictly to impartially report on the historical context and the ideas contained in this ancient source material, explaining what it meant to them and the general wisdom it offers now.
That is a vital disclaimer, because this text has been historically misused to justify all sorts of tyranny.
Right.
So let's rebuild the historical context. The early Christians were widely viewed by the Roman Empire as a subversive, rebellious, and dangerous political threat.
Why is that?
Because they pledged ultimate allegiance to a different king, Jesus. In a culture built around the Roman emperor cult, where Caesar was often hailed as a divine lord and savior of the world, saying Jesus is Lord sounded like literal treason.
That's a direct threat to the state.
And Paul is writing this while the Roman Empire, a pagan military dictatorship, is an absolute power.
And yet, despite the fact that this very empire would eventually execute Paul, the text asks believers to submit to civil authorities.
It does.
It tells them to pay their taxes, to pay custom where custom is due, and to respect order. It portrays government, even a flawed one, as a mechanism ordained by God to prevent anarchy, to protect the innocent, and to wield the sword against evildoers.
It is a pragmatic, sobering view of human nature. The underlying assumption is that without some form of governing authority wielding the threat of force, the sword society rapidly devolves into chaos, where the strong violently devour the weak.
So the magistrate exists to maintain public terror against bad behavior.
Right.
But this raises a massive question. Does this mean blind, absolute obedience to a dictator? If Nero says, "Oh, worship my statue," do they do it?
This is where we must apply wisdom and discernment. Matthew Henry's commentary provides essential clarity here, distinguishing between general, enduring wisdom and absolute blanket statements.
What's the distinction?
Henry notes that this text is a general rule for private citizens to maintain public peace. It operates on the assumption that the government is acting according to its divine design to punish evil and reward good.
So it's about general providence.
Yes, it is a statement of general providence. However, it does not mean obeying a magistrate when they command something plainly contrary to a higher moral law.
So if the government says, pay your road tax so we can pave the Appian Way, you pay it. If the government says, murder your neighbor or worship Caesar, you resist.
Precisely. And the historical record proves this. The early Christians were entirely willing to be thrown to the lions rather than worship the emperor as a god.
They drew a line.
They practiced civil disobedience when it came to ultimate moral allegiances. But Paul's point here is that they were commanded to be model citizens in everyday civic duties. They weren't supposed to be unnecessary troublemakers, tax evaders, or political insurrectionists.
There's a fascinating pivot in verse 8 that changes the whole tone of this civic discussion. After talking about paying taxes and giving honor to authorities, Paul writes, "Owe no man anything, but to love one another. For he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law."
It's a huge shift.
How does that reframe the way we view our modern civic duties?
It shifts civic duty entirely out of the realm of legalism and into the realm of relationships. It moves it from a burden of forced compliance to an act of neighborly love.
Give me an example.
Think about it.
Yeah.
You don't just stop at a red light because you are afraid of a traffic camera and a fine. You stop at a red light because you love the driver in the intersection and you don't want to kill him.
Oh, I like that.
You pay your taxes not just because you fear an IRS audit, but because those taxes contribute to the common good, to the roads, the public schools, and the emergency services that protect your neighbor.
That completely changes the motivation. It drains the resentment out of civic obligation.
It really does.
Paul goes on to say that all the major commandments, don't steal, don't murder, don't covet, are summed up in love your neighbor as yourself. Because love works no ill to its neighbor.
Exactly.
If you truly love someone, you won't steal their car. You don't need a law telling you not to do it. Love itself regulates the behavior.
It is an incredibly high standard. And Henry points out a beautiful nuance here. Love is a debt which can never be fully discharged.
What do you mean?
Well, you pay your financial debts, you pay off your mortgage, and you are done. The transaction is complete. But the debt to love your fellow human being is continuous. You wake up every single day owing that debt anew.
So here is your practical question for this section, shifting from the ancient Roman roads to your daily life. Are you holding any debts, and I mean financial, emotional, or social debts, that you are currently avoiding paying?
Good question.
And more importantly, how can you reframe your daily civic obligations, from paying your taxes to how you drive your car on the highway, as an active extension of loving your neighbor?
When you reframe your life that way, you start to see how deeply interconnected we all are. Every action has a ripple effect.
It does.
And that intense interconnectedness is exactly what makes navigating differences of opinion within a community so incredibly difficult. Which brings us right back to the internal life of this startup community in chapter 14 and the beginning of chapter 15.
Let's get into it.
The core wisdom here is mutual forbearance. It is the principle that the strong must bear with the weak, and that the community must absolutely not fracture over secondary, non-essential opinions.
Paul calls these secondary issues doubtful disputations. And to understand why this was threatening to tear the Roman Church apart, we need to go back to the sensory reality of the ancient world.
Yes, the daily grind.
You mentioned earlier that the Jewish and Gentile believers were clashing. What were they actually fighting about?
They were fighting over the calendar and the menu.
The menu.
Specifically, dietary laws and the observance of holy days. Imagine the meat markets in ancient Rome. Much of the meat sold there had been previously offered as a sacrifice in a pagan temple to Jupiter or Mars.
Right.
For a Jewish convert who had spent their entire life strictly adhering to the laws of Moses, where dietary purity was a core marker of their identity and holiness, eating that meat was unthinkable.
It would feel wrong.
It felt like a profound sin. Their conscience simply wouldn't allow it. It felt like participating in idolatry. So to be safe, they ate only herbs and vegetables.
And on the other side?
On the other side, you had Gentile converts and some Jewish believers like Paul himself who understood that these ancient dietary laws were obsolete in their new faith.
They felt free.
They knew an idol was just a block of wood or stone. They felt total freedom to buy the cheap steak at the market and eat it with a clear conscience.
Paul labels these two groups. He calls the ones who felt free to eat the meat the strong in faith, meaning their conscience wasn't restricted by these old, obsolete rules.
Correct.
The others, who only ate vegetables, he calls the weak in faith, meaning their conscience was still burdened by rules that no longer applied.
Yes. And what was the result of this difference? Total toxicity.
Really?
The strong, who felt free, were looking down on the weak, despising them, mocking them as legalistic, superstitious, and backwards.
Oh, that's awful.
Meanwhile, the weak, who were eating their herbs were judging the strong, condemning them as sinful, worldly, and unholy compromises. They were literally destroying their profound spiritual community over a debate about butcher shops.
Let's translate this into our modern reality, because human nature hasn't changed. We might not be fighting over meat offered to Roman idols, but we are currently living in the golden age of cancel culture and social media warfare.
Oh, absolutely.
We go to war every single day over highly nuanced, non-essential opinions. It could be debates about ethical consumerism, like boycotting a specific coffee brand, or parenting styles, educational choices, or endless cultural arguments.
It's constant.
We still have these self-appointed strong and weak factions constantly judging, despising, and excommunicating one another over doubtful disputations.
What is fascinating here is the solution Paul offers. He doesn't act like a CEO stepping in to establish a theological committee to finally decide who is technically right about the meat.
He doesn't settle the debate.
He doesn't issue a definitive ruling on the menu at all. Instead, he attacks the attitude. He tells them to stop judging each other's motives. He writes, "Who are you to judge another's servant? To his own master he stands or falls."
But the text does put a significantly heavier burden of responsibility on the strong, doesn't it? It says, "We then, who are strong, ought to bear with the scruples of the weak and not to please ourselves."
Yes, and this is where we hit a massive obstacle to growth for modern readers. We desperately love to be right.
You really?
We love to win the argument and prove our intellectual superiority.
Mm-hmm.
But this text demands that we prioritize the spiritual safety, the conscience, and the peace of our brother or sister over our fundamental right to exercise our personal freedom.
That's tough.
Paul literally says, do not destroy the work of God for the sake of food. This is incredibly uncomfortable for us today because modern society views personal liberty and individual self-expression as the highest possible goods.
Let's unpack this with a modern analogy to make the mechanism clear. Imagine you are on a group road trip.
Okay.
You are the driver, you know your car, you know this stretch of highway perfectly, the weather is clear, and you are perfectly comfortable and safe driving 80 miles per hour. Your conscience is totally clear.
Sounds good.
You are the strong in this scenario. But your passenger in the front seat was in a horrific, traumatic car accident a few years ago. They are terrified. Their knuckles are white. They're sweating. They're having a panic attack.
Oh, wow. Okay.
They are the weak in this scenario. What do? Do you yell at them, "I have the legal right to drive 80. You're just being weak and irrational. Get over your trauma"?
If you do that, you might be legally correct, but you completely destroy the peace of the car. And you deeply traumatize your passenger. You ruin the relationship.
Exactly. The mature, loving thing to do is to take your foot off the gas and slow down to 65. Not because driving 80 is inherently a moral evil, but because the human being sitting next to you is infinitely more important than the speed you are traveling.
That's a great point.
You restrict your own freedom out of love.
That analogy perfectly captures the spirit of what Paul is teaching. Albert Barnes notes that we should never use our Christian liberty in a way that gives occasion for strife.
Even if we're right.
Even if we are absolutely conscious, we are right about a minor issue. An obstinate, stubborn adherence to our rights that causes our brother to stumble makes us guilty of walking uncharitably.
I love the comparative insight you brought up earlier from Matthew Henry's commentary. It's a famous maxim that perfectly summarizes this entire section on doubtful disputations.
Yes, Henry highlights this brilliant, enduring principle. In things necessary, let there be unity. In things unnecessary, let there be liberty. And in both, let there be charity.
That is profound.
The tragedy of human history is that we almost always reverse this. We demand absolute, rigid unity in the unnecessary things, which entirely destroys the charity.
So what does this all mean for you today? Here's your reflection for the week. I want you to identify a doubtful disputation in your life right now.
Something secondary.
Right. Is there a secondary issue, a lifestyle habit, a political opinion, a cultural debate, where you are currently judging or despising someone else who sees it differently? Or conversely, is there a personal freedom you are loudly flaunting that is causing genuine distress to someone close to you?
Are you driving 80 mile an hour?
Exactly. Can you choose to take your foot off the gas? Can you keep your conviction to yourself before God, as the text says, in order to preserve peace and build up the relationship?
Choosing the relationship over being right is the ultimate hallmark of maturity. And as we transition to the final section of this manual, we see that this kind of maturity isn't achieved in a vacuum.
No, it takes people.
It requires a vast web of relationships. This brings us to the end of chapter 15 and all of chapter 16. The core wisdom here is the absolute necessity of a supportive, diverse network of friends, patrons, and co-workers to accomplish any meaningful mission in the world.
I have to admit, when I first read through this text, I totally glossed over this final section.
Most people do.
It just looks like a dry list of ancient names and travel itineraries. It feels like the credits rolling at the end of a movie.
Right, time to leave the theater.
But when you actually slow down and read it closely, it's a fascinating, vibrant window into Paul's real everyday life. In chapter 15, he's talking about his travel plans. He's going to Jerusalem. He wants to visit Rome. He hopes to eventually get to Spain.
He's planning.
And he talks about taking a collection of money from the believers in Macedonia and Achaia to help the poor, famine-stricken saints in Jerusalem.
This detail about the financial collection is vital because it proves that everything we just talked about wasn't just theoretical philosophy.
It was real.
It was happening. It shows the practical reality of the community blueprint. The Gentile believers in Greece are sending hard material wealth to the Jewish believers in Judea.
That's unity in action.
It is a tangible financial manifestation of unity across deep ethnic and geographical lines. They aren't just sending thoughts and prayers, they are sending economic relief.
And then we hit chapter 16, which is this incredible rapid-fire list of personal greetings. He names around 26 specific people, but the details attached to these names are what make it amazing.
Exactly. For instance, he begins by commending a woman named Phoebe. He calls her a servant, or deaconess of the church in Cenchreae. And he explicitly commands the Roman Church to receive her and assist her in whatever business she has.
Why?
Because she has been a patron and helper to many, including Paul himself. Many historians and scholars believe that Phoebe was actually the courier who carried this very letter, the book of Romans, hidden in the folds of her garments.
Wait, really?
Yes, traveling hundreds of miles by dangerous sea and land routes to deliver it.
That is astounding. A woman entrusted with delivering what would become one of the most influential documents in Western civilization. And he goes on, he greets Priscilla and Aquila.
Yes, his fellow workers, who he explicitly says risked their own necks for his life. These were people who faced death to protect him.
Incredible.
He greets Andronicus and Junia, his relatives and fellow prisoners, who he specifically notes are of note among the apostles and who were believers before he was.
There's an amazing hidden detail down in verse 22. A guy named Tertius suddenly chimes in.
Yes, the voice of the letter briefly changes.
Wait, who is Tertius? I thought Paul wrote this entire letter.
Paul authored it, but Tertius was the amanuensis, the scribe. He drops a quick line saying, "I, Tertius, who wrote this epistle, greet you in the Lord."
He just slips himself in there.
He's the guy physically dipping the pen in the ink, his hand cramping, while Paul paces the room dictating the theology.
It completely shatters a very persistent modern myth. We have this terrible habit of romanticizing historical figures as lone, brooding geniuses.
We do.
We imagine Paul sitting alone in a dimly lit room, having solitary visions, and single-handedly changing the world through sheer willpower. But this chapter proves he was not a lone wolf.
Not at all.
He was deeply, inextricably embedded in a massive network of men and women, rich and poor, slaves and free citizens. He literally couldn't do his work without Phoebe's financial patronage and bravery, Tertius's physical pen, or Priscilla and Aquila risking their necks.
It is a profound lesson in interdependence. And what really stands out to many historians is the prominence of women in this list.
I noticed that. Mary, Tryphina, Tryphosa, Persis, Julia, Rufus's mother, who Paul says acted like a mother to him as well.
It's a long list.
In a deeply patriarchal, male-dominated ancient Roman world, this level of inclusion, public honor, and recognition for women's hard work and leadership is striking. It challenges a lot of modern assumptions about the ancient church just being an old boys' club.
It certainly does. It shows a living, breathing community where diverse gifts were recognized and utilized regardless of restrictive societal norms. Now, as we read this ancient mail, we must also apply wisdom with discernment regarding some of the cultural nuances.
Like what?
Well, for example, in verse 16, Paul commands them to greet one another with a holy kiss.
Yeah, I can imagine that going over terribly at a modern corporate HR retreat.
Indeed, which is why we have to separate the cultural expression of the time from the enduring principle underneath it.
Okay, what's the principle?
The enduring wisdom isn't the physical act of kissing on the lips or the cheek. In their first century Mediterranean culture, a kiss was a standard, everyday greeting of respect and familial warmth.
Like a handshake or a hug today.
Exactly. The mandate here is for genuine, warm, and holy affection within the community. It's a call for relationships that are authentic, transparent, and devoid of hidden, malicious agendas. It's the exact opposite of the traitorous, transactional kiss of Judas.
So the practical application here is a profound exercise in gratitude and recognition. I want you to look at your own life. Who is the Phoebe in your life? Someone who has sponsored you, supported you, or carried your ideas forward.
Good question.
Who is the Tertius, the person doing the unglamorous, behind-the-scenes administrative work that makes your public success possible? Who has risked their neck for you professionally or personally?
We all have someone.
This week, don't just think about them. Reach out and explicitly acknowledge their contributions. Send the text, write the note. Don't be a lone wolf. Recognize your network.
Because that recognition, that deep relational glue, is the bedrock of a resilient community that can actually change the world around it.
Okay, as we wrap up this extensive deep dive into Romans 12 through 16, we want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over.
Yeah, something to chew on.
We've talked a lot about peace, forbearance, and melting hostility, but there's a line near the end that frames all of this in a shocking way.
Yes. In chapter 16, verse 20, right in the middle of these warm, affectionate greetings, Paul drops a stunning, almost violent promise.
What does he say?
He says, "And the God of peace will crush Satan under your feet shortly." Notice the profound paradox in that sentence.
Crushing.
It is the God of peace who does the crushing. We usually associate crushing with a God of war, a God of wrath and swords.
Right.
But here, the text implies that when a community actually lives out the radical love, the non-retaliation, the mutual forbearance, and the deep networked unity described in these chapters, it doesn't become passive, weak, or fragile.
It becomes a weapon.
It becomes a forceful, unstoppable weapon against darkness, division, and evil in the world. True peace is aggressive against chaos.
That is so powerful.
So the question for you to explore on your own is this: how might your workplace, your family, or your neighborhood fundamentally change if you stopped trying to aggressively win every petty argument and instead became an agent of that kind of aggressive, unifying, crushing peace?
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.